Welcome back to Chess Dog. Today we have a game between two of the most interesting and entertaining players in the world. In the past, when top players would play each other, they'd be in a magazine article or a lot of focus in a database. But now the best players in the world are playing each other online, and we are seeing an unbelievably high number of quality games, even played at fast time controls. This game, for example, played between Hikaru Nakamura and Alireza Firouzja, has an end game that just is like a study. Now, because it's a blitz game, there are some mistakes on both sides, but this is one of the greatest end games I've ever seen. Truly a brilliancy. Hikaru has white, Firouzja has black. Let's jump right in. E4, C6, knight C3, D5. Firouzja plays the Caro-Kann, knight to F3. Hikaru responds with the two knights. He doesn't want to just destroy black. He just wants to get a nice positional advantage. Firouzja plays bishop g4. Another alternative is de4 if you want to play the knight f6 variation as black. But the main line is bishop to g4, h3, bishop takes, queen f3, and e6. So basically what Firouzja is doing, he's giving up the two bishops, the light squared bishop in particular, but now he wants to use his pawns, place them on light squares, and create a light squared wall to replace that bishop that he's lost. Now Nakamura plays queen to e2. The main move here is d3. Queen to e2 is actually the 12th most commonly played move here. In fact, it's only been played twice, and the other player was Hikaru Nakamura. But in that game, he won. He beat Maxime Vachier-Lagrave with this queen e2 move. d4 was played in response by Firouzja, gaining space, and that's now a novelty. Knight to b1, knight to e7, and g3. White can expand on the king side with f4, maybe fianchetto the bishop at g2. Firouzja plays h5. The idea is to control g4 and limit the expansion of white's pawns on the king side. h4 is played by Nakamura. The idea is he's not necessarily going to go to g2. He might go to h3. And after knight to d7, that's exactly what Hikaru does. He places the bishop on h3, puts pressure on the e6 pawn. At the moment, this pawn looks well defended. But as time goes on, the pressure on this pawn is going to grow and create some real problems for Firouzja. The knight goes to g6 to liberate this bishop at c8. The computers show an absolute brilliancy for black in this position. The best move is actually g5, of all things. The idea is after pawn takes, the knight goes to g6, revealing the queen's attack on the g5 pawn. And after f4 to defend it, then h4. And white's entire kingside pawn structure is collapsing, being undermined by this h4 pawn. A brilliant idea from our Silicon friend. Knight to g6, though, just liberates the bishop at f8. d3, and now bishop to b4 check. There are a lot of things white can do here. He can play c3. He can block with the knight or bishop. But instead, Hikaru decides to just play king to f1. He's going to try to tuck that king away at g2. Queen to e7. Now black has all of his pieces off the back rank, and he can castle either short or long. a3 hits the bishop. Bishop to a5. Knight goes to d2. Perhaps he can land on the c4 square, hitting the bishop, or maybe even doing something at d6. And here, Firouzja decides to castle long. Perhaps he was a little worried about the activity white could generate after f4. So he goes to the queen side with his king. b4 gaining space to attack on the queen side, bishop to c7, and now knight to b3, putting pressure on this d4 pawn. And all of a sudden, we see the value of this bishop at h3. If black goes ahead and defends the pawn by playing e5, that opens up this entire diagonal for this bishop. So the bishop at h3 is beginning to become very useful. Knight to b6, aiming at the a4 square. You usually don't put the knights on the side of the board, but a4 would be a very powerful square, limiting white's ability to attack on the queen side, and also putting some pressure on this weak square on c3. So the knight goes to c5, controlling the a4 square, and now bishop to d6. Turns out this is a mistake. The better move was king to b8, just getting the king to safety. But bishop d6 allows this really powerful move from Nakamura. He plays bishop to g5, skewering the queen to the rook. And the only way to get out of that skewer is to play f6, but now look at e6. The bishop at h3, the knight on c5, both hit e6, and all of a sudden that h3 bishop is very, very powerful. Bishop takes e6, check. Firouzja moves his king to b8, threatening to take the knight, after which the bishop will hang. bishop to f5, counterattacking the knight at g6. As it turns out, the best move here was bishop to d2. And after bishop takes knight, you can just retake the bishop with a pawn because you're counterattacking the knight at b6. After queen e6, pawn takes, king g2. White could play rook h to b1, and he's just bringing all kinds of pressure on the queen side. So bishop to d2 was a better move there. But bishop to f5 was played, hits the knight at g6. Pawn takes bishop, bishop takes g6, and now g4. And let's look at the position now. The two kings are in very different situations. Now, Hikaru's king at f1 is actually in worse shape than Firouzja's king at b8. There's a half-open f-file leading right to the king. So now, Hikaru's king is much less safe than Firouzja's is. So the best move, according to computers, is to actually give up the pawn with e5, and then after the exchange of queens, we see that White has a very strong position. He can play his knight to e6, and his own king is no longer in any danger. In the game after e5, the bishop took the pawn, or the knight, excuse me, at c5, bc5, queen c5. A more accurate move might have been knight to c8, but it really wouldn't have changed much. Queen c5, e6, marching the pawn ahead, rook to e1, backing up the pawn, while the bishop controls e8 might have been better. e6, knight to c8, keeping a blockade on this pawn on e7, rook to e1, and now rook to h6, hits the bishop, bishop to f7, and knight to e7. So for the moment, black has a firm blockade at e7 of the e6 pawn. The pawn, though, is very far advanced. That's the only danger for black, but for the moment, it's well blockaded. Queen to e5 check, getting queens off of the board. A fairly equal but complex endgame. Black's king is in a better position to enter the fray. Rook to d5, offering the exchange of rooks. Rook to g5, hitting the g7 pawn. The pawn advances. Black does not want to take on g5, because then just pawn takes, hitting the rook. And after rook takes h5, black is winning. So instead, he plays g6. Now king to g2. The other rook can shift over, and he can play f3, activating his king. King c7, rook e1, defending the pawn. King d6, rook e4, putting pressure on d4. c5 defends d4, but now rook takes d5 check, king d5. f3 to get the white king in. gf3, king f3, b5, king f4, a5. So the endgame is shaping up, and we can see black's queenside pawns are very formidable. This pawn phalanx 4 versus 3 on the queen side. Bishop to e8 attacks the pawn at b5. The pawn advances. a4 locking it up. Now rook to h8 to shift the rook over to the queen side. Bishop back to f7, rook to b8. So there's a major threat for black in this position. The threat is to play b3 on the queen side and then later attack this d3 pawn. So the proper move for white would have been rook to e1 to contest that advance. But instead, he plays the king to g5, threatening to come into f6, hitting the knight so the pawn can advance. But now b3 is strong, and after cb3, rook b3, the d3 pawn is almost impossible to defend. Bishop to g6 is played, rook to d3, and now rook to e5 check, discovering against the rook. So rooks are traded and come off the board, king to e6. Now, white has to create a distraction with his h-pawn to survive this endgame. So Hikaru plays g4, king g4, and in this position, Firouzja played king to d5, the most obvious move in the world, right? You just support the pawns and advance them, but it turns out that was a blunder. Computers show us that the most accurate move was actually knight to d5, and after advancing the pawn, the knight goes to c3, creating a barrier for the king and attacking the a4 pawn, and black is just winning. Bishop b5, and then you just eat the h-pawn. But Firouzja plays king to d5, the most obvious move. h5, c4, hitting the bishop with tempo. Bishop to h7. White wants to use this bishop to keep Firouzja's knight from stopping the pawn on h5. d3 is advanced. And now after h6, black is winning again. The correct move here is king to f3. That's the drawing concept, and it involves the most ridiculous move ever. King to d4, h6, c3, and then to hold the draw, the move is bishop to e4. This is crazy. And after c2, just your queen at the same time with check. And after d2, you just play bishop to c2, blockading on the light squares. Just absolutely crazy stuff. h6 was actually played in the game. And again, it just looks like the most obvious thing in the world is to play king to d4 to support these pawns in their advance. It turns out that throws away the win again. The winning idea is d2. Then after bishop c2, this is what does it for black, is the move knight to g8. And then when the pawn advances, knight to f6 check is a fork of the king and the pawn. And that's why black wins this particular position. So instead of king to d4, the best move is to just go ahead and play d2. So king to d4 is the move played in the game. So white has one move to save the game. King to f3 allows the king to get over fast enough to slow down these pawns. But he plays the move king to g5 instead. And that throws away the win for good. c3, the pawns are advancing. White gives up the bishop. Bishop takes d3. King d3, now h7. Now, this pawn cannot be stopped from queening. But after c2, queen, and now black queens with check, still has the knight at e7, and that's the key tempo black needs after king g4, queen c4 check, king g3, knight f5, king h3, queen grabs the remaining pawn, queen d8, knight to d4, queen d5, queen to b5. And in this position, Hikaru with white lost on time, but he is clearly losing on the board. The computers give like plus 20 or something like that. A truly amazing game, a lot of back and forth, and that endgame is really just a study-like endgame. I hope you've enjoyed this game. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by clicking the thanks button down below. And even after going over this great game from Alireza Firouzja, there's still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to see is in this video right here, so be sure to watch that next for some really mind-blowing chess. Goodbye.